Desperate times call for desperate measures, people say. But how, you might ask? When people are desperate, sometimes they will do anything to get what they want or need, and sometimes that anything is absolutely terrible, such as how the Great Depression ultimately led to World War II. The Great Depression started in America due to overuse of credit, overproduction, and buying on margin, but it became global due to the import tariffs that not only were part of what caused it, but caused it to be global by basically crippling global trade. The Great Depression caused horrible things, such as people committing suicide because they had lost everything, people starving to death in the streets, families dying of sickness because they couldn't heat their homes, banks failing, businesses going bankrupt, and marriages and families breaking up over money. People had to sell all their possessions to buy food, and parents had to send away their children because they could no longer afford to support them. In response to this, world leaders all had different approaches. Russia never really had a problem with the Great Depression, seeing as they're a communist government. However, their response was to advertise jobs in America, but not telling the people that Russia is a communist state, and the Americans hated communism, so this was somewhat of a dirty trick on desperate people. Britain's response was to raise taxes, mainly on the wealthy, and to regulate currency to stop inflation. France just made working and finding jobs better and easier for the people by creating more jobs, increasing worker pay, giving them more vacation time, increased worker benefits, and less hours. The U.S. and FDR created something called the New Deal, which was a group of programs made for three purposes: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief was to directly help the people and businesses out immediately. Recovery was to help the country as a whole, not exactly businesses and families, and reform was to make sure that this would never happen again. FDR's New Deal greatly helped the country, but did not completely solve the Depression. What really ended the Depression was the war, because increased production was needed, and while men were away at war, women got jobs working in factories and building war materials, and even children got to help out in some aspects of it. Germany, however, was having a lot of trouble. Their response to the Great Depression was to print more money. This turned out to be a bad decision, because inflation was so high that people had to carry a wheelbarrow of money to buy a single loaf of bread. People would burn money in their fireplaces because it was cheaper than buying firewood, and Germany's starvation problem was much worse than anywhere else in the world. After being blamed for all of World War I and being stuck with a huge debt, they didn't have much, even without regard for the Depression. The Treaty of Versailles left them bitter for being left out of the failed League of Nations, along with giving them the whole debt problem and stripping them of their military. Adolf Hitler was elected as leader of Germany and started turning it into a country where the government had full control of the people's lives, also known as fascism. Although this greatly helped the economy and made the nation strong and prosperous, it came at the cost of the freedom of the people. Hitler, as leader of Germany, began to take over lands that didn't belong to Germany or any of the Allied powers, and meanwhile the Allies were just letting him do it, thinking that if they ignored him, he would stop. President Roosevelt wanted the U.S. to remain neutral. However, he agreed that they could lend and lease weapons and war materials to any country they wanted to. This was called the Lend-Lease Act. He would then secretly meet with Winston Churchill to create a secret agreement that would uphold free trade and self-government choice in all nations. This agreement also made the U.S. the most powerful nation in the world. Soon, Germany was taking over other countries, and then Japan realized that they saw America as a threat because their territories were so close to some of the U.S.'s territories. Japan planned a sneak attack on the U.S., not knowing that the U.S. had foreseen this because they'd figured out a way to read Japan's coded messages. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, one of the U.S.'s naval bases, on December 7, 1941, invoking the anger of the U.S. and bringing them to war against Japan. The U.S. went into total war for the second time, the other time being World War I, and women were working in factories and shipyards like men. After a long fight with Japan where both sides did a lot of terrible things, such as firebombings, brutal killings, and sex crimes, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on first Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, Japan. Japan eventually surrendered to the U.S. Just because desperate times lead to desperate measures doesn't mean that such measures will solve all the problems. In the end, Europe was really broken up by the fact that there were so many people dead from the Holocaust and all the fighting. Bombings and fighting had reduced hundreds of European cities to rubble. Many major cities had been firebombed and crushed, and most of the people who could work, like farmers, factory workers, and businessmen, had been killed. World War II was most certainly caused by desperate times, but in the end may have left the world in a worse condition while also setting the stage perfectly for the Cold War.